Stop the Nazi Games, indeed. Hallo allemaal, daar zijn we er weer. RHTV live. Natuurlijk vanuit het mooie Maastricht. Ja, laten we natuurlijk zien waar het ligt op de kaart. Zo. So for the international audience, hello to you all from the beautiful city of Maastricht. So, of course, we're going to look at politics and geopolitics, and the primary subject is basically the Sudan war. But first, we're going to take a look at our neighbors in Belgium, right? There's a famous YouTuber in Belgium, and you know, he goes to festivals without paying tickets and does stuff like that. And there was this fraternity, and there was this guy that, you know, needed to do stuff to get into the fraternity, and he died basically. And that YouTuber spilled out some names, and now he's sentenced basically. He's not in jail, but he gets 3 months probation, you know, so when he does something wrong, he'll end up in jail. And a 20,000 euro fine for telling the wrong name, basically. So this is what's happening in Belgium, and we're going to take a look at a video. Ja, er is een bekende YouTuber in België en die is naar zijn studentenvereniging toegegaan. En dan had je een bepaalde inwijding, om daar aangenomen te worden. En degene is overleden. En dat heeft die YouTuber bekendgemaakt. Ja, en ja, hij heeft ook een verkeerde naam erbij verteld. Wie er aanwezig waren destijds. En ja, dat is zeer, zeer schadelijk. Ja. Dus we gaan even kijken naar deze bekende YouTuber. Acid 2 heet hij op YouTube. En we gaan even kijken. Dat is deze meneer hier zo. We gaan even kijken naar dit hier. So this was the YouTuber that had spilled out some names and said the wrong name and has a 20,000 euro fine. And 3 months probation, you know. When he does something wrong, he'll end up in jail.
YouTuber Acid krijgt straf. Hij moet 800 euro boete betalen en 20.000 euro schadevergoeding. En hij krijgt een voorwaardelijke celstraf van 3 maanden. Dat betekent dat als hij nog een keer de fout ingaat, dat hij dan 3 maanden de gevangenis in moet.
Ja, ik heb een gevangenisstraf met uitstel gekregen. Dat betekent dat ik niet naar de gevangenis moet, maar het is wel nog steeds een gevangenisstraf.
Acid is een van de populairste YouTubers van België. En ook in Nederland volgen mensen hem. Ook door deze video.
Yo, YouTube, Acid hier. Welkom bij deze nieuwe video. Vandaag, speciale video, man. We gaan mensen exposen.
En daar krijgt hij de straf voor. Acid maakte de namen bekend van mensen die volgens hem meer straf verdienden dan dat ze hadden gekregen. En dat had te maken met de dood van deze jongen, Sanda Dia. Hij wilde graag lid worden van een studentenvereniging. En daarvoor moest hij hele rare opdrachten uitvoeren.
So, this guy here, this guy wanted to be, you know, a member of the fraternity. And he needed to do a lot of weird stuff, like ice bath and a lot of alcohol and stuff like that, you know. So, and he died.
Hij wilde graag lid worden van een studentenvereniging. En daarvoor moest hij hele rare opdrachten uitvoeren. In een put met ijskoud water zitten bijvoorbeeld en veel alcohol drinken en vieze dingen eten. Hij werd daar zo ziek van dat hij overleed. De groep studenten waarvan hij dat moest doen, reuzengommers heten ze, die kregen werkstraffen, klusjes doen dus. En veel mensen vonden dat veel te weinig.
To express our deep disappointment.
Ik vind dat de straf harder had moeten zijn, want dat is niet oké wat er is gebeurd.
Ook Acid was boos.
Wat vier
So the members of the fraternity got like a job sentence, basically. You know, clean up the road, or you know, stuff like that. So, and yeah, very, very sad to see.
Klusjes doen dus. En veel mensen vonden dat veel te weinig.
To express our deep disappointment.
Ik vind dat de straf harder had moeten zijn, want dat is niet oké wat er is gebeurd.
Ook Acid was boos.
wat 400 euro en 300 uur werkstraf is niet genoeg. Deze reuzengommers, zij kunnen er op de een of andere manier van afkomen zonder gepubliceerd te worden door de media. Niemand post en gezegd.
En daarom maakte hij wel bekend wie het waren.
Ga 5 mensen uit de reuzengom kiezen. Een beetje info over hen. Ga je verhaaltjes vertellen over hen. Vertel hoe tarig ze zijn.
Maar de rechter zegt dat Acid dat niet had mogen doen. De studenten en hun familie zijn bedreigd en lastig gevallen doordat Acid hun namen bekend maakte. Hij krijgt zelfs een hogere straf dan de reuzengom-studenten na de dood van Sanda Dia. En dat...
So his penalty is higher, right, than the people that made a guy do ice baths and stuff like that. You know, his sentence is higher than the students that, you know, made him do all sorts of stuff and ended his life basically. So, and family members and stuff are being harassed because the YouTuber exposed, you know, these names. And very sad to see. Anyone can make a mistake, right? But this mistake cost him 3 months probation and a €20,000 fine. That's the freedom of speech we have in the European Union.
niet had mogen doen. De studenten en hun familie zijn bedreigd en lastig gevallen doordat Acid hun namen bekend maakte. Hij krijgt zelfs een hogere straf dan de Reuzegom-studenten na de dood van Sanda Dia. En dat vindt hij heel oneerlijk.
€20.000. Hoeveel hebben de Reuzegommers per persoon moeten betalen? Weet u dat? En dit komt ook op mijn strafblad. Dat is waar.
So he's asking how many money did these students pay? You know, they paid nothing. They got away with it with just a job fine. You know, clean up the road, and yeah, that's the justice system in Belgium. So, dat is onvoorstelbaar. Hij krijgt de boetekleed en andere mensen komen ermee weg. Gewoon wat papier pikken langs de weg voor een paar uurtjes. En dan heb je je taak gedaan. Dan heb je de werkstraf gehad. Ja. Onvoorstelbaar. Maar dit gebeurt.
Met de Reuzegommers ook niet gebeurd is. Zij hebben niks op hun strafblad. Hij is volledig blanco gebleven. Op de mijn staat er nu dat ik een gevangenisstraf heb.
Er zijn sowieso heel veel mensen die achter Acid staan.
Dat was niet zo slim om die video te maken, maar ik vind ook dat hij dat zeker niet verdient. Ik vind dat hij met een waarschuwing ervan af zou moeten kunnen komen.
So, we're also going to take a look at this here. 3 months jail. This here's Acer, or not Acer, Acid 2. This is the guy, you know. So, we're going to take a look at this here.
Maar ik vind het belangrijk dat dit nog eens gezegd wordt. Ik heb mijn reuzegom video, de expose, niet geüpload om subs, followers of likes bij te krijgen. Als Belgische justitie faalt in de zaak Sandadia en als al die boys van reuzegom er vanaf komen met 3 keer niks, dan is het normaal dat er volkswoede ontstaat. Dan is het normaal dat de samenleving er roept. En dan komt heel deze shit in de handen van de media. En als de media maandenlang zegt dat zij de namen naar buiten gaan brengen als het vonnis valt en het dat niet doet, dan wordt die volkswoede nog 1000 keer erger. En dat is bij mij ook gebeurd. Ik ben een publiek figuur die een platform heeft, dus ik heb geroepen, omdat ik het gevoel had...
So he's basically saying he's a public figure who has a platform, and he had the moral notion to give out names of that fraternity, and he says, I'm doing nothing wrong, you know. It's the justice system in Belgium who's wrong, and he's right.
Dat ik in de positie was om iets te moven, om iets te doen en om de kreet van de samenleving luider te laten horen. En dat heb ik gedaan. En daar ben ik trots op. En dat meen ik. Dat heb ik ook in al die fucking interviews gezegd. Ik zou dit zo opnieuw doen, omdat ik me hetzelfde voelde als iedereen. En dat is wat ik gedaan heb. Als justitie faalt, dan reageert de samenleving. En dat is wat er is gebeurd. Ik heb dat op mijn manier gedaan en nu ben ik op hun manier gestraft. Ik heb een 3 maand gevangenisstraf voorwaardelijk gekregen met de uitstel van 3 jaar en een schadevergoeding van €20.000 die ik moet betalen aan die familie. Dat is fact. Dat is echt fact. Vooral omdat ik nu een strafblad heb waarop staat dat ik een gevangenisstraf heb. Die reuzengommers hebben niks. Ze hebben niks. Er staat niks op hun strafblad. Dit gaat vergeten worden. Zij hebben werk.
So the fraternity has nothing, you know. Yeah. But he has a €20,000 fine because he spelled out the wrong name. Heel erg triest dat dit gebeurt, mensen. Nogmaals, deze YouTuber die heeft wat naam bekendgemaakt en ja, hij gaf hem toevallig de verkeerde naam. En de rechter zei, dat mag jij niet doen. Ja, €20.000 boete. En ja, er is ook iemand overleden die eigenlijk ja, een broeder wou zijn binnen de studentenvereniging. En ja, dat is dus niet zo gegaan, helaas. Ja. Dus ja, waar is het recht? Waar is het recht, vraag ik me af. Ik zal ook eventjes een antwoord geven. Deze filmpje. Deze filmpje krijgt aandacht bij RHTV Live. Zo. En dan gaan we dat posten. Kijk, hup, comment. Deze filmpje krijgt aandacht bij RHTV Live. Nou, wie weet, misschien kijkt u ook op mijn kanaal. Wie weet. Dus ja, acid, hoe je ook heten mag. Ik vind ook dat jij niks fouts hebt gedaan. De Belgische justitie is in deze erg fout. Ja. Dus, goed. I also gave a comment. I hope he watches the channel too. You know, and he's on the right side of history, and the Belgian Justice Department is on the wrong side of history. So, he did good work. Now, on to what's happening in Sudan, right? First, we're going to show it on the map where Sudan is, so people have a better notion of the situation. Here we have Egypt, which is a stable country, right? We have Sisi in power, which is basically was a general, and he took power because the Muslim Brotherhood was in power, and they wanted to change the constitution, which the army said, nope, we're not going to do that. And Morsi got imprisoned, and he basically died in prison, and Sisi became leader of Egypt. So that's a stable country as far as you can notice, right? Because we have Israel right next to it with the Gaza Strip, and very, very sad to see what's happening there. The people in the Gaza Strip cannot flee anywhere. They're basically stuck and get no water, no food, no electricity. So very, very sad to see. And the border of Egypt and Gaza is, they're fortifying the wall. Basically, they have a very big high wall, right? And very, very sad to see what's happening there. So, but Egypt is still a stable country, and under Egypt we have Sudan. Now, Sudan is a very complex country, right? Many ethnicities and many, many people that have other religious aspects and stuff. So we're going to take a look at a video of Sudan, and it's going to explain the Sudan war, right? Because many people are involved, many actors. We have Wagner in Sudan, right? Russian paramilitary force in Sudan. We have Ukraine in Sudan. We have neighboring countries also supplying one of the two parties that are fighting each other. So we're going to take a look at a video which explains more about Sudan better than I can explain. So let's take a look at this here. Large screen. There you go.
Below to support Real Life Lore directly by signing up, where you can watch dozens of additional and exclusive full-length videos in my ongoing Nebula Modern Conflict series, covering recent major wars and crises, including this video's next part, covering the course of the genocide that was committed across Darfur in the mid-2000s. As major ongoing wars in Ukraine and Gaza continue to capture most of the world's headlines, there is another third war that's just as catastrophic and consequential for the world as these other two that's going on right now in Sudan, that is nearing its one-year anniversary of beginning. Sudan has been locked in a devastating civil war ever since April of 2023, when two rival generals commanding two rival armies in the country began openly clashing and firing upon each other's forces in the Sudanese capital, Khartoum. Ever since then, Khartoum, a city that had a pre-war metropolitan population of more than 6.5 million people, has transformed into a smoldering crater of a war zone subjected to devastating airstrikes, artillery bombardments, armored assaults, and fierce house-to-house and street-to-street combat. There are some who've even referred to Khartoum now as the Aleppo of Africa, after the biggest city in Syria that was almost completely destroyed by the fighting during the civil war in that country last decade. More than half of Khartoum's pre-war metropolitan population is believed to have fled the area for their lives, as the rival armies clash inside for control. While nationwide, the United Nations estimates that at least 13,000 people have already been killed since the war began, while more than 10.7 million people, or more than 1 in 5 Sudanese, have been forcibly displaced from their homes. 9 million of these people are displaced within Sudan's borders, representing the largest internal displacement crisis anywhere in the world right now that's even larger than in Ukraine. While roughly 1.7 million more Sudanese have fled the country as refugees, and more are likely to continue following out of Sudan's massive internally displaced population, representing a potential cascading crisis as refugees flee into the already fragile states that surround Sudan, like Libya, Chad, the Central African Republic, South Sudan, and Ethiopia. All countries that are either currently trapped in their own civil wars or have had recent devastating civil wars in the past decade that could become reignited again. And what many of these Sudanese are fleeing from is not only the massive violence being waged between the two rival armies in the country, but a potentially renewed genocide that is ongoing in Sudan's perennially troubled Darfur region. Just last month, in January of 2024, a damning report made to the United Nations Security Council that is considered to be credible concluded that one of the rival armies in Sudan, known as the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF, systematically massacred somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 people in just a single city in West Darfur over the summer of 2023, and forcibly drove hundreds of thousands more across the border into neighboring Chad. If that report is accurate, it potentially represents more deaths in just that one city than what the entire nationwide death toll from the war previously stood at, which implies a crisis going on in Sudan that is of a scale far worse than what most outsiders believe or know. The reports coming out of Darfur today are being further reinforced by the fact that for every 2 female refugees who have escaped across the border into Chad, only 1 male refugee has made it, which implies that the RSF has been systematically targeting men in Darfur for mass killings. The conflict being waged in Sudan today has evidently dumped gasoline upon the embers that were still smoldering in Darfur, left behind from the last genocide in the region that largely went on between 2003 and 2005, when around 300,000 people in Darfur were killed. And as the fires of genocide potentially rage again in Darfur today, and as the rival generals fighting for domination over the country's leadership shows no signs of stopping anytime soon, Sudan faces the genuine risk of further balkanization and separatism after the previous secession of the South a decade ago back in 2011. And as the war within Sudan rages, multiple external wars within the war are being fought by numerous outside powers that are busy transforming Sudan into one of the world's most complicated proxy battlefields, pitting the United Arab Emirates up against Saudi Arabia, Egypt against Ethiopia, Turkey against Libyan nationalists, and there are even credible reports of Ukrainian special forces fighting gun battles with Russian Wagner Group mercenaries on the streets of Khartoum that are all overlapping the primary war between the two rival Sudanese generals. And in order to understand all of this fiendish complexity that's going on in Sudan right now, and why Sudan's fate is so important to the entire rest of the world, it helps to begin with a brief overview of how Sudan's geography and history have led to the current crisis. Sudan, you see, has been a troubled place for practically all of its history going back centuries. The country's territory exists at the crossroads of the Arab world to the north and the east and the sub-Saharan African world to the south and the west. And this placement between these two worlds has defined Sudanese culture for ages. Between the 14th and 15th centuries, Arab nomads began migrating and settling the area of modern Sudan, which up to that point was almost entirely inhabited by African peoples. By the 19th century, the African-ruled Fund and Darfur sultanates ruled the west of modern Sudan, while the Ottomans ruled the east and the coast. Later on in the 19th century, most of modern-day Sudan was conquered by the Egyptians and further Arabized. And then in 1899, under pressure from the British, the Egyptians agreed to transform Sudan into an international condominium ruled jointly by themselves and the UK. The nominally independent Sultanate of Darfur, ruled by Africans, was later invaded by the British and Egyptians in 1916, conquered, and annexed into Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, which created Sudan's borders that would persist for the rest of the 20th century. Sudan would be granted its independence from the British and the Egyptians in 1956, and it would emerge as the largest country in Africa and one of the top 10 largest countries in the entire world, taking up a geographic area roughly a third of the size of the mainland continental 48 United States. And with this huge size and this location at the crossroads between the Arab and African worlds, Sudan was also one of the world's most highly diverse countries as well. It was home to nearly 600 distinctly different ethnic groups and more than 400 different languages, though Arabic was the more common lingua franca in the north and English was the more common lingua franca in the south owing to the colonial period. Sudan's northeast, based around the upper reaches of the Nile River and the country's coastline on the Red Sea, was predominantly Arab and Muslim, while the peripheral regions of the country to the west in Darfur and to the south in southern Sudan were substantially more diverse. Darfur was overwhelmingly Muslim, but largely populated by various sub-Saharan African tribal groups who were largely settled farmers, along with smaller numbers of nomadic Arab-identifying herders in the north. And on the other hand, southern Sudan was populated by hundreds of different sub-Saharan African ethnic groups who were largely not Muslim at all, and who followed either various traditional African animist faiths or Christianity. Because of these sharp internal divisions, Tensions bubbled up to the surface in Sudan between the Arab Muslim-dominated north and the ethnically and religiously distinct peripheral regions. And the country's first civil war between the north and the south began in 1955, the year before independence was even granted. That first civil war was devastating, and it would last for the next 16 years until 1972. Around 1 million people were killed across Sudan during the war, and it ended with the north agreeing to grant the southern half of the country its political autonomy, with the establishment of the Southern Sudan Autonomous Region. However, only a decade later in 1983, under the rule of the Arab military dictator Ghaffar Mohammedan Nimeri, Khartoum would revoke the South's hard-fought autonomous status and introduce strict Islamic Sharia law for the entire country, including within the non-Muslim, non-Arab, formerly autonomous South. This ended up leading to the southern half of Sudan rebelling against the government again, which led to the Second Sudanese Civil War that will last for another 22 agonizing years until 2005, in which another estimated 2 million more people across the country would be killed, making the wars in Sudan among the deadliest conflicts worldwide since World War II. And a huge part of the reason why the Arab-dominated Sudanese government didn't want the South to leave and was willing to pay millions of lives to keep them was because that's where most of the country's oil reserves happened to be located. Significant oil reserves had only been discovered in Sudan later on in the game by Chevron in 1978, in between the two big civil wars. And it turned out the country had similar reserves of oil as Oman or Mexico, and was a top 25 oil state worldwide. However, an overwhelming 75% of all Sudan's discovered oil reserves were in the non-Arab south of the country. And so, if the South was autonomous and kept all of their oil money for themselves, then the North would never actually benefit from them. This is a huge reason why the North decided to suddenly revoke the South's autonomy only a few years after the oil was discovered there, and why the North was then willing to fight a war that killed millions to try and hang on to the South. But by 2005, the country was exhausted for more than 2 decades of war, and all the parties involved agreed to sign what became known as the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, which established a timetable for an independence referendum to be hosted in southern Sudan. That referendum would be held a few years later in January of 2011, and it resulted in an utterly overwhelming landslide victory for the Yes campaign, with 98% of the votes choosing independence, which led to South Sudan formally seceding from the rest of the country a few months later in July of 2011 as the world's newest country. And they took 75% of Sudan's oil wealth with them in the process. But many unresolved questions between them continue to linger on. An oil-rich border region between them about the same size as Lebanon that's known as Abyei was set up by the peace as a condominium to be jointly ruled by both Sudan and South Sudan as equals. And so, both countries have continued claiming the territory for themselves that has sporadically resulted in violence. 2 more highly ethnically and religiously diverse southern states that remained within Sudan, South Kordofan and Blue Nile, were supposed to also host vaguely defined popular consultations in 2011 to determine their own constitutional futures. But these popular consultations were indefinitely suspended by the government in Khartoum. And so a splinter group of the primary South Sudan People's Liberation Movement, or SPLM, that was instrumental in achieving South Sudan's independence, formed across the border in South Kordofan and Blue Nile that became known as the SPLM North. They would continue to wage a low-level insurgency against the Sudanese government in South Kordofan and Blue Nile, with demands for greater autonomy in each and a more federalized Sudanese government structure. And within only 2 years of South Sudan's independence, the world's newest country would descend into its own catastrophic civil war in 2013 that would last for 7 more years until 2020 and kill another 400,000 people. During the Second Sudanese Civil War in 1989, a charismatic Sudanese army general known as Omar al-Bashir launched a successful coup d'etat that overthrew the democratically elected government in the country, as it was attempting to negotiate with the rebels in the south. Al-Bashir was a hardline Islamist and Arab nationalist, and during his authoritarian military regime, he pursued a policy of harsh crackdowns against the non-Arab and non-Muslim rebels in the south and in Darfur. In 2003, non-Arab rebel factions in Darfur launched attacks against Sudanese military facilities in the name of greater autonomy, and al-Bashir responded with one of the 21st century's most brutal campaigns of repression. The al-Bashir regime created a militia organization out of the nomadic Arab-identifying herding peoples of northern Darfur that they called the Janjaweed, which roughly translates into English as the devils on horseback. faced with the rebellion of the non-Arab peoples in southern and western Darfur, and faced with a parallel ecological crisis of the Sahara Desert continuing to expand southwards and pressuring their migration southward, the Janjaweed rolled across southern and western Darfur with their horses and their guns, and burned hundreds of African villages to the ground and massacred around 300,000 people within only 2 years of unprecedented violence between 2003 and 2005. Actions that have been labeled as a genocide by the United States government and by multiple UN agencies. Millions more were forcibly displaced by the violence in Darfur in the 2000s, and the International Criminal Court, or ICC in The Hague, would take the unprecedented step of issuing multiple arrest warrants for Omar al-Bashir in 2009 and again in 2010 on charges of crimes against humanity and genocide for his government's actions in Darfur, which made al-Bashir the first sitting head of state to ever be ordered arrested by the ICC in its history. Al-Bashir and his regime, naturally, rejected the ICC's jurisdiction in Sudan and refused to cooperate with the warrant, which continued to fuel al-Bashir's own dictatorial paranoia. He expelled NGOs from the country, like Doctors Without Borders and the UN World Food Programme, accusing them of spying in the country on behalf of the ICC, while financial sanctions slapped on Sudan by the United States were continuing to bite him and his economy even further. Sudan and the United States had had a fraught relationship pretty much ever since he had assumed power. His Islamist ideology led him to host Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda in the country up until 1996, which led to Washington designating Sudan as a state sponsor of terrorism and introducing comprehensive sanctions against Sudan in 1997. The al-Qaeda bombings at the United States embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998 that killed hundreds resulted in the United States retaliating by firing cruise missiles at alleged al-Qaeda targets that were still operating in Sudan. Even harsher economic and trade sanctions were applied by the United States on Sudan, following Washington's accusations of the regime carrying out genocide in Darfur in the 2000s. And after the loss of 75% of the country's oil reserves with the South's independence in 2011, the Sudanese economy was being relentlessly battered, and it crashed by 17% in 2012 alone. Fearful of the struggling economy and the South's independence negatively impacting his domestic popularity, and fearful of the ICC's active arrest warrant for him, al-Bashir grew increasingly paranoid that the military would eventually conspire to overthrow him, just like how he had overthrown the previous government that had came before him. This led to him establishing a system of supposedly coup-proofing himself in Sudan, with the creation of 2 parallel military structures within the country. The primary Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, that were placed under the command of General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and the creation of a new paramilitary force out of the genocidal Janjaweed militias from Darfur, that evolved into the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF, under the command of rival General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, better known by his nom de guerre, Hamedi. For years across the 2010s, the RSF continued carrying out violent pogroms against Darfur's non-Arab populations to try and keep Darfuri rebel activity suppressed, and they served as a mercenary group for hire in multiple external conflicts beyond Sudan's borders. RSF troops traveled to neighboring Libya to fight on behalf of the warlord Khalifa Haftar's Tobruk-based government during the civil war there, while thousands of other RSF fighters were contracted by the United Arab Emirates and transported to Yemen to fight for the Emiratis' interests in the civil war there as well. Al-Bashir's intentions within Sudan were to always play the ambitions of the SAF and the RSF against one another, in order to keep them both too busy and occupied with each other to ever be able to collaborate together in overthrowing him. But all of that suddenly changed in 2019. The Sudanese economy was beginning to shrink again, with negative growth in GDP in both 2018 and 2019. And frustrated with the worsening economy and al-Bashir's continued 3-decade-long authoritarian rule, popular protests and uprisings against him began forming in Khartoum that began demanding his resignation and greater democracy. And as the protests grew larger, the rival generals al-Burhan and Hamedi of the SAF and the RSF, who were supposed to always be struggling against one another, actually decided to collaborate together and launched a joint coup d'etat that finally overthrew al-Bashir from power, and in the aftermath, they set up what they claimed was only a temporary military administration that would eventually transition Sudan back towards a civilian-led democratic government, which the country hadn't known ever since the 1980s. A man named Abdallah Hamdok was quickly appointed as Sudan's new interim civilian prime minister until the elections could take place at an undetermined future date. But then he was also really quickly forcibly removed from office and kidnapped by the SAF and the RSF during another military coup in October of 2021, when they suspended the constitution. Civilian protests against Sudan's military leadership erupted again, while the IMF and the World Bank suspended their debt relief programs to Sudan in response, worsening Sudan's financial crisis even further. The civilian prime minister, Hamdok, was briefly reinstated to his position by the military the following month in November, but then he almost immediately resigned in January of 2022 as the anti-military protests continued, and as the military continued repressing them with ever-increasing violence. Al-Burhan and Hemedti and their rival armies were then left over as Sudan's de facto joint leaders. But pressure from Sudan's civilian population and protests were growing on them to finally commit to a timetable of fully transitioning back to civilian rule. In December of 2022, they agreed on a deal that established a 2-year timeline for nationwide elections that would finally establish this civilian leadership. But the deal also laid out the groundwork for Hemedti's RSF army to become absorbed and integrated into the primary SAF army that was led by Al-Burhan. And critically, the deal didn't actually specify a clear timeline for any of this to actually take place. Al-Burhan was evidently insisting on a shorter 2-year timeline for the RSF to become fully integrated into the SAF under his command, while Hemedti was counter-insisting on a much more drawn-out 10-year process to do so. Tensions between both sides continued growing, with Hemedti seemingly unwilling to give up his army quickly, and with both generals wary of giving up any of their power to a future civilian government. On the 15th of April in 2023, the tensions finally reached a boiling point, and gunfire and explosions rang out across Khartoum. The SAF and the RSF each blamed each other for firing the first shot, and the newest civil war in Sudan had begun. Both sides began the civil war with similar numbers of manpower at their disposal. The RSF consisted of more veteran fighters with recent combat experience serving as mercenaries in the civil wars in Libya and Yemen. But as a paramilitary militia, they lacked the air power and armor that the primary SAF had under their command. For nearly a year now since the war began, both the SAF and the RSF have been openly battling against one another all across the country for the ultimate control of Sudan, while the RSF has been increasingly gaining the momentum. They've managed to capture most of the capital city, including Sudan's only oil refinery and Khartoum's international airport, which prompted the SAF to withdraw their headquarters from the capital and relocate further behind the front line in Port Sudan on the Red Sea. The RSF have captured virtually every major city in the Darfur area, and in December of 2023, they overran the major city of Wad Madani to the southeast of Khartoum, which had a pre-war population of more than 330,000 people. And as the successors to the Janjaweed that carried out the US-defined genocide in Darfur in the early 2000s, the RSF have begun committing similar atrocities in Darfur today, after several Darfuri rebel factions announced their support for the SAF and Al-Burhan. Multiple large-scale massacres of Africans by RSF forces in Darfur have been reported, which has led the United States to publicly accuse the RSF of war crimes and ethnic cleansing. But the United States has also accused the SAF of committing war crimes during the conflict too. Faced with the more experienced fighters in the RSF, the SAF has resorted to their superior air power to bomb RSF positions from the sky, and they frequently carried out indiscriminate airstrikes to civilian-populated areas in the name of attacking the RSF and their supply lines. And the RSF has been continuing to swell their numbers because they're attracting large numbers of volunteers from thousands of miles away. When you look in northern Africa through the lens of ethnicity, you will see a nearly continuous belt of Arab-identifying tribes that extends westward from Sudan and Darfur, through Chad and Niger, and then into Mali and Mauritania. Hemedti, as a member of one of these Arab-identifying tribes himself, has made strategic alliances and overtures to many of these other tribes spanning all the way to the Atlantic. And thousands of men from these regions have flocked to join the RSF in his active fights in Sudan and in Darfur. Many of them are coming for loot and plunder, as cars and other valuable goods are stolen in Sudan during their raids and then transported westward across the Sahel and resold to unsuspecting buyers in so-called Dagalo markets, named after Hamdan Dagalo himself. And unlike the Janjaweed of the past, who largely carried out their atrocities in Darfur with horses and AK-47s, the RSF of today are acquiring very heavy advanced weapons to help them in their war this time around, like anti-tank weapons, surface-to-air missiles, machine guns, and grenade launchers because of all the different proxy wars that are taking place in Sudan, atop of the war between the RSF and the SAF. First and foremost is the struggle for supremacy in Sudan that is ongoing between the rival royal families of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Both are major investors in the Sudanese economy, with substantial assets they stand to lose if the side they don't want to win comes out on top. The Emirates have already invested more than $13 billion into the country, while the Saudis announced in 2022, before the war began, that they would invest up to $24 billion into the country as well. Sudan is, after all, a very valuable piece on the board in the United Arab Emirates' grander geopolitical objectives around the Red Sea. Abu Dhabi and Riyadh are each actively competing against the other to become the leading Arab and Persian Gulf state. Though the UAE only has a fourth of Saudi Arabia's population, the Emirates have an economy that punches far above their weight that's about half the size of the Saudis. And the two are the leading economic powers in the Arab world. The Saudis dominate the eastern shore of the Red Sea with their own shoreline, one of the most critical shipping routes in the world, with the Suez Canal to the north and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait to the south. The UAE has therefore spent years attempting to build up their position and influence around the Red Sea's shores, to challenge Saudi hegemony in the area, by backing the secessionist Southern Transitional Council in Yemen against the Saudi-backed government and Iranian-backed Houthis, and by building up military bases on the Yemeni islands of Socotra and Perim, by investing hundreds of millions of dollars into developing the port of Berbera nearby to the Red Sea in the breakaway state of Somaliland, by supporting the government of Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia, and by cultivating ties to the RSF and Hemeti in Sudan, whose fighters the UAE used in Yemen and fought alongside of in Libya before the war in Sudan even began. The UAE then quickly chose to back Hemeti and the RSF in Sudan once the war began, hoping that an outright RSF victory in the country would cement their growing geopolitical influence and clout in the Red Sea region at the expense of the Saudis. And although Abu Dhabi denies it, there is credible evidence that the UAE has been supplying the RSF with massive quantities of weapons. A report from the Wall Street Journal showed several dozen armed deliveries that the UAE made to the RSF after the war began through the airport of Amjaras just across the border in Chad, while the UAE is further giving the RSF access to their banks and financial system so they can skirt around US sanctions in exchange for Emirati access to the RSF's controlled gold mines and oil fields in Sudan. Khalifa Haftar, the warlord who rules the eastern half of Libya, that the UAE and the RSF both supported for years during the Libyan civil war, has also apparently decided on returning the favor by opening up the stockpiles of the previous Gaddafi regime in Libya to the RSF. That has included anti-tank weapons in addition to convoys carrying Libyan oil to power the RSF's vehicles. And in addition to the military support they're receiving from the UAE and from Haftar's Libya, and from thousands of volunteers who are coming from all across the Sahel, Hemeti and the RSF are also receiving significant military support from Russia's paramilitary Wagner Group as well. The Wagner Group has been known to have had a presence within Sudan since at least 2017, as a mercenary group for hire. Wagner soldiers were contracted in Sudan to guard valuable gold mines in the unstable Darfur region, and they brought in Russian weaponry in exchange for Sudanese gold. The Wagner Group fought in Libya for the Haftar regime in the east alongside the RSF and the UAE. And after Russia's invasion of Ukraine began in February of 2022, Wagner's operations in Sudan became even more critical to the Russian government. Sudan is the world's 10th largest producer of gold, with extensive gold mines found all across the country, but particularly in Darfur, that was under the influence of the RSF. Perhaps anticipating their future increased needs for Sudanese gold, Hemeti himself was in Moscow the very day the Russians invaded Ukraine, signing paperwork. After the United States and the European Union and other Western countries severed the Russians from their financial systems following the invasion, the Russians began having to turn to more alternative and covert methods of funding their army in Ukraine, like by securing more untraceable gold from places like Sudan. Within the first year of Russia's invasion of Ukraine beginning, the Wagner Group and their affiliates are believed to have managed to covertly smuggle nearly $2 billion worth of gold out of Sudan to help finance their army. And they've almost certainly smuggled billions more since the war in Sudan between.
This is why the war in Sudan is so important. You know, it's all about gold and power and stuff like that. You know, this is so disgusting to see. Het is gewoon ziekelijk om te zien dat er allerlei andere partijen erin betrokken zijn. We zien Wagner, Oekraïne die Wagner aanvalt, in Sudan, En ook andere spelers, regionale spelers, die dan wel die partij kiest of dan wel die partij. Ja, het is heel erg triest. Maar dit geeft wel een beter beeld van wat er gebeurt in Sudan.
Between Hamedi and al-Burhan began, which led to the Russians more firmly cementing their alliance with the RSF. Hamedi's forces currently control most of the country's gold trade, and they've been able to essentially trade billions of dollars worth of gold to the Wagner Group that is then smuggled back to Russia in exchange for advanced Russian weaponry, like surface-to-air missiles, howitzers, and multiple rocket launchers, in addition to Wagner troops themselves serving as mercenaries. As weapons from the United Arab Emirates are allegedly entering into the RSF's hands from across the border in Chad, Russian weaponry is also allegedly entering into their hands at the same time through the Wagner Group's parallel operations in the Central African Republic and in Libya. Russia is interested in an RSF victory in Sudan to secure continued access to their gold that will help them further circumvent Western economic sanctions, and to eventually establish a Russian naval base on Sudan's coast on the Red Sea. A long-time objective of the Kremlin's that would add increased security along their own oil export route towards their biggest customers in India and China. If the RSF emerges victorious in Sudan, they would be likely to reward the Russians for their heavy support in the aftermath. And for these reasons, the Russian and Emirati foreign policies are directly aligned in Sudan, which is probably part of the reason why Vladimir Putin himself made an official visit to the United Arab Emirates in December of 2023 to coordinate their strategies, where he was welcomed with the highest levels of pomp and circumstance by Abu Dhabi. And it's also why credible reports emerged this month in February of Ukrainian special forces being present in Sudan fighting Wagner troops as they attempt to sever Russia's gold trade with the country that is helping to finance their war machine. The war is also causing a tremendous amount of instability to the South and South Sudan as well. South Sudan may have taken the vast majority of the country's oil reserves with them back in 2011, but the country remained entirely dependent upon Sudan for their ability to actually export any of their oil to global markets. South Sudan is landlocked, and a pipeline constructed in the 1990s known as the Greater Nile Oil Pipeline between their oil fields and Port Sudan on the Red Sea remained their only viable way to transport large amounts of oil to global markets. The pipeline passes directly through the Sudanese capital city of Khartoum, that's also home to the country's only oil refinery, and which has been a catastrophically violent war zone for nearly an entire year now, which has been severely disrupting South Sudan's ability to export their oil and earn any money. This has led to proposals to construct a new oil pipeline from South Sudan's fields that'll run through Ethiopia instead towards the port of Djibouti. But this is also potentially problematic, because Ethiopia isn't really that much more stable than Sudan is, with its own active civil war and armed rebellions continuing. They could threaten the new pipeline's viability too. The SPLM North rebel group that's active in Sudan, South Kordofan, and Blue Nile states has escalated its insurgency into a full-scale rebellion since the war began as well, with some of its members even advocating for further partitions of Sudan, either in the form of South Kordofan and Blue Nile's outright independence or a union with South Sudan. While violence between Sudanese and South Sudanese forces have further escalated over the contested oil-rich Abyei region further to the west as well, with its ultimate status between them still being undetermined. There is now an increasing degree of concern of Sudan devolving into either a Libya scenario, with the capital and the country west of the Nile River falling under the control of Hamedi and the RSF, and the territory east of the Nile and along the coastline falling under the control of al-Burhan and the SAF. Or a further Balkanization scenario for Sudan in which the country could further collapse along ethnic and religious lines, not only in South Kordofan and Blue Nile, but in Darfur as well, which was a nominally independent sultanate until the early 20th century when it was conquered and absorbed into Sudan. A combination of the Libya and Balkanization scenarios for Sudan are also possible too, as is a complete takeover by either Hamedi or al-Burhan and their proxy supporters, and increased refugee surges into neighboring fragile states like Ethiopia, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, Chad, and Libya stand to exacerbate or trigger additional conflicts in Africa in a cascading domino effect of war. And Washington is growing increasingly frustrated with this uncertain situation and worsening instability in Sudan. So far, all peace and ceasefire negotiations and attempts in Sudan between the rival generals and their proxy supporters have failed. Washington definitely doesn't want an outright RSF victory in Sudan, due to fears that an RSF-dominated Sudan would become a pro-Russian pariah state in Africa like Syria is in the Middle East. And they would continue funneling gold to Moscow to continue undermining the West's sanctions on Russia, and probably allow a Russian port to be established on the Red Sea, too. The United States is trying to convince the UAE to abandon their support for the RSF in order to help avoid this outcome. But they aren't very likely to be successful because of how close the US-UAE relationship is outside of Sudan. The UAE has been the most significant Arab state to normalize its relations with Israel since the Abraham Accords began in 2020. And owing to its high degree of influence and investment in the country, the UAE was further instrumental in securing Sudan's subsequent normalization with Israel in 2021, which curried a huge degree of favor towards the UAE and Washington. The UAE is also one of Washington's largest customers for the American arms industry, worth tens of billions of dollars. Abu Dhabi agreed on a deal with the previous Trump administration to purchase a whopping $23 billion worth of American military hardware that included 50 cutting-edge F-35 fighter jets and 18 MQ-9 Reaper drones, even though the Biden administration later paused the deal for review. The United States also maintains a major Air Force base in the UAE at Al Dhafra that's home to around 5,000 American military personnel that proved critical to supporting America's wars against ISIS in Iraq and Syria and against the Taliban in Afghanistan. Convincing the United Arab Emirates to abandon its support for the RSF in Sudan would be a tough sell, as it would compromise on Abu Dhabi's ambitions to become the new hegemon in the Red Sea at the expense of Saudi Arabia. And the United States doesn't want to alienate the United Arab Emirates too much because of all of their cooperation with Israel, their shared antagonism towards Iran, and huge arms purchases, not to even mention the fact that the UAE is also the 8th largest oil producer in the world, and can significantly affect the global price of oil in America's favor by choosing to either cut or raise production. Nonetheless, there are increasing calls within Washington for the United States to begin quietly supporting the SAF and al-Burhan in the country anyway, to destroy the Russian gold smuggling route, to begin bringing some kind of stability back to Sudan in the increasingly chaotic Red Sea region that threatens U.S. allies in the region like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and to bring a halt to the RSF's apparent ethnic cleansing and potentially genocidal campaign of annihilation being waged across Darfur. Because of how remote and undeveloped of a region Darfur is, and how few people there actually have access to the internet or other telecommunications, and because of the nature of the fog of war, nobody really knows exactly what's been going on there or how many people have died since the RSF overran the area. But there is that United Nations report that estimates a massacre of as many as 15,000 people in the city of El Janina alone. Satellite images have revealed dozens of villages that have been torched and several more mass graves. And more than 500,000 people, mostly from Darfur, have fled across the border into neighboring Chad since the war began. Many of their eyewitness testimonies speaking of escaping across streets littered with the bodies of the dead. Kamis Abakar, the governor of the West Darfur province, plainly stated back in June of 2023 that the RSF was waging a campaign of renewed genocide against the Africans in Darfur again, and demanded an international intervention to save them. Merely hours after he made these comments, though, Abakar was kidnapped and murdered by forces that allegedly belonged to the RSF. The U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, publicly condemned the RSF for committing crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing in Darfur in December of 2023, and he referred to the RSF's actions as, quote, haunting echoes of the genocide that began almost 20 years ago in Darfur. That previous genocide in Darfur is widely regarded as being the first genocide committed during the 21st century. It was largely perpetrated by the RSF's predecessors between 2003 and 2005, on a scale and tempo of ferocity that has been compared to the Rwandan genocide of 1994. Hundreds of thousands of people in Darfur were systematically annihilated under orders that were given by the Sudanese regime of Omar al-Bashir himself, while the issue of what was happening within Darfur became a media sensation of its time in the West, with celebrities from Angelina Jolie to George Clooney tirelessly campaigning to try and spread awareness of the horrors that were going on there. The unbelievable atrocities that were carried out in Darfur by the Janjaweed and the Sudanese government in the 2000s has a direct impact on the echoes of the genocide that are ringing out in Darfur again today. Echoes that are largely falling on ears that are distracted by the parallel atrocities and crises happening in Gaza and in Ukraine.
We are not distracted. We are watching and we are understanding the situation, right? You know, we could talk about Ukraine, Russia, we could talk about Gaza, Israel. But this is very, very important. Dit is heel erg belangrijk dat we hier zicht over hebben, over wat er nou precies in Sudan allemaal gebeurt. Er zijn weinig mensen die het hierover hebben. Maar wij bij RHTVLive laten licht schijnen. En ja, zodat mensen een beter beeld hebben over wat er allemaal in Sudan gebeurt.
I want to tell the next part of this story that covers everything that happened in Darfur during the genocide of the 2000s and why it's important to understanding the horrors that are happening in Darfur today. But unfortunately, due to the inherently violent, disturbing, and recent nature of discussing one of this century's most appalling crimes, would cause the video to become demonetized and age restricted, which I actually completely believe should happen. But it also ultimately means that YouTube's algorithm that's based around ads would suppress the video here on YouTube. And so it wouldn't ever actually.
These people only know war, right? Generations of people living under war circumstances. It's very, very sad to see. And there's still a war going on in Sudan. And, you know, this is not a forgotten war, right? We are showing what's happening. And so people have a better understanding of what's really happening in the world. This is a power vacuum, right? Where you have two armies, and these two armies are getting supplies from other countries and stuff like that to keep on fighting. We want peace. That's what we want. I don't want any Sudanese people coming over to the Netherlands, right, because their country is in war. Ik wil geen Soedanese mensen hier in Nederland. Dat klinkt ook weer racistisch, maar zo bedoel ik het niet. Omdat daar oorlog is. Nee, zij moeten hun dingen oplossen, ja. En ze moeten ervoor zorgen dat hun land stabiel is. Ja. Ja, dat gebeurt niet, hè. Je ziet ook niet dat Nederland eventjes een ronde tafelgesprek doet met allerlei landen. Dat zie je dus ook niet. We moeten nog een coalitie maken. Oh my god, man, echt waar. Pieter Omtzigt en oh my god. Met die mensen kun je geen afspraken maken. Dus, ja, ik had ook liever gezien dat wij als Nederland, exceptioneel zoals we zijn, gewoon ronde tafelgesprekken hielden over bepaalde regio's en zoiets. Maar ja, dat, nee, helaas, nee, dat zien we niet. So I had hoped that the Netherlands would do some roundtable discussions, just like they're doing in Qatar, right? And, you know, we should be leading in that. We should be neutral, right? Don't choose any sides. But we have an idiot as prime minister. And even though he's demissionary, he's still a big idiot. Mark Rutte, ongelooflijk. We komen nooit van hem af. Wie weet, misschien komt hij bij de NATO te werken. Nou, dan ben je al helemaal ver van huis. So, who knows, maybe Mark Rutte is going to work for NATO. You know, he's been prime minister for the Netherlands for 13 odd years. And the whole country is broken because of his policies and stuff like that. So, yeah, and who knows? Maybe he'll be leader of NATO. Who knows? You know, wij hebben nee gezegd. Weet je nog? Met het handelsverdrag met de Oekraïne. 2016. Toen zeiden we al, ja, als we hiermee doorgaan met die handelsverdrag, krijgen we oorlog met Rusland. Nou, wie blijkt weer gelijk te hebben? Hè? Dus, ja, en we zeiden nee. Heel veel mensen hadden toch door van, ja, Oekraïne is toch niet zo'n heel pluis land. Ja, laten we dat voorkomen, dat de handelsverdrag gewoon doorgaat. Maar ja, dan heb je zo'n eikel zoals Mark Rutte. En die zegt gewoon van een nee, maakt hij een ja. En dan heb je de Nederlandse bevolking, die heeft zoiets van, huh? Heeft Mark nou van een nee een ja gemaakt? Serieus? Ja, echt serieus. Bla 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 bla. En de Nederlanders doen niks. Doen gewoon niks. So, we had a trade agreement with Ukraine. 70% of the trade agreement was in act. And the last 30% we had a referendum about the trade agreement. And the Dutch population said no. Even though our prime minister said yes. So, you know, it's really amazing. And the Dutch population does nothing. You know, it's like, huh? Did Mark really do that? We zijn gewoon met stomheid geslagen. En ja, ik vergeet het in ieder geval niet. En ik vergeef het hem ook niet. Eigenlijk moet Mark Rutte samen met Hugo de Jonge en al die andere mensen moeten de bak in. Die moeten gewoon de bak in. So, all these politicians we used to have, like Kaag and Hugo de Jonge and all these other people, they should be in prison for lying to the Dutch population, right? So, we're going to look at Russell Brand, and he has something to say about the vaccines. And very, very interesting stuff, because there's a lot coming out about the vaccines. And we warned people, right? We warned people, don't take the shot, but people were like, wow, you're crazy, man. You know, you're crazy. But I may be crazy, but I am right. Ja, er komt steeds meer naar buiten over de pikjes. En Russell Brand, die heeft daar een mooi filmpje van gemaakt.
I remember what they...
Moeten we wel eerst even terugspoelen. Zo. Rewind.
Multi-country COVID study has revealed, get this, that potentially vaccines cause adverse events. Does this mean that the truth about vaccines is beginning to permeate even the mainstream media? Hello there, you awakening wonders. Thanks for joining us on our voyage to truth and freedom. Remember, you can support our content by becoming an awakened wonder. We make additional videos every week and do live interviews with political figures, journalists, real journalists, I'd call them, that you will enjoy. There's a link in the description. If you can join us, join us. Join our movement. For surely now more than ever, it's become evident that people that once existed on the periphery with marginal views were in fact the adults in the room. Those of you that were was saying, have they had enough time to conduct these clinical trials? Are you sure there's not adverse events? Does natural immunity suddenly mean nothing? Are you supposed to vaccinate in the middle of a pandemic? All of those questions that sort of sounded reasonable at the time have now been officially deemed reasonable as a result of the largest ever multinational study that has revealed, as you already know, not as a result of this study because you knew already, that vaccines cause adverse events. I wonder though, given some of the connections and funders of this study, whether this is damage limitation or how this will play out, because the CDC are involved in this study, Pfizer are involved in this study. So I'd love to know in the comments what you think is happening strategically. Is it that there's been such a swell of information from independent media, from radical renegade, Harvard and Stanford scientists, that now the truth is unignorable and unavoidable? Let's get into it.
It's a question so many people have wondered. Does the COVID-19 vaccine have an impact on my health?
Yeah, so many people have wondered, making it out. It's like, oh, they're men on the moon. I do wonder sometimes, did we actually go to the moon? I mean, that flag looks strange. Is there more than one light source? And now we're like at the point of acknowledging that people are going, excuse me, I had a bloody heart attack. I was a world-class athlete. Now I can't stand up straight. My face hurts. My lip isn't moving properly. Many people have wondered if they're being lied to on an unprecedented scale. Here's the news. You were.
Now, the largest COVID study ever conducted is providing some answers. A link between the vaccine and heart and brain disorders has been uncovered.
Oh, bloody hell. Armageddon, the apocalypse. What's interesting, and what will be interesting, is how this is seeded into the mainstream, how it is mitigated, and how it's offered as a kind of palliative, when really what I'd like to see at this point is world leaders and Albert Bourla coming out and sort of standing with their hands crossed in front of their reproductive organs, say, I'm very, very sorry, we lied.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So we're going to show the I'm sorry clip. Wait a minute. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
Hello, I'm Tony Hayward, President and CEO of BP. Our accidental drilling spill again in the Gulf is a tragedy that should have never happened. And to all those affected, I want to say, we are deeply sorry. We're sorry. We're sorry. We're sorry. Sorry. We're sorry. We're sorry. Sorry. We're sorry. I'm deeply sorry. Sorry.
Yep. So let's get back to Russell.
On a massive scale about this product. What they'll do is, I suppose, minimize this and use this as an example of transparency, but this is not an example of transparency. This is an example of what has had to happen as a result of constant pressure and the ongoing inevitable revelation of a medication that's this controversial and has had this degree of negative impact. If this could have been avoided, it would have been avoided, but it couldn't be avoided, and you participate in that, so well done.
Yeah, researchers with Global COVID Vaccine Safety Project reached this conclusion after collecting data from nearly 100 million people across 8 different countries. Today I spoke with a local medical expert who says the COVID vaccine still outweighs the risks.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah.
We also talked to everyday people about their attitude toward getting the shot.
I'm going through a lot of mental and physical things now after, and it wasn't like that before.
Elizabeth Foster says she questions if the COVID-19 vaccine she took in 2020 has anything to do with the decline she says she's experiencing in her health.
Let's for a moment pause and acknowledge that now you can have someone on the news saying, I'm worried that this vaccine's giving me headaches and making me feel not very well. Because it's not that long ago that actual news anchors went, you should be shamed if you ask questions about this vaccine.
I think we have to stop coddling people when it comes to this and the vaccine, saying, oh, you can't shame them. You can't.
Yeah, Don Lemon, you stupid idiot. You're being paid by the big pharma, right? Just to push your needle inside someone. Don Lemon, you should be ashamed. You should be ashamed for giving bad advice. You know, if I were in America right now and Don Lemon would be right in front of me, I'd ask him very, very hard questions. You know, who do you get paid for? Huh? It's not CNN, right? Big Pharma. We know. So.
Call them stupid. You can't call them silly. Yes, they are.
Oh, seems that you've changed your perspective. Now let's remember their tone and their temperament during the pandemic period. People were hysterical and ridiculous. It's irresponsible, you shouldn't be allowed to say that. Or whole companies were employed to censor information online. Experts telling the truth, trying to pre-warn us. Oh, excuse me.
I know. I was trying to warn people and we got banned during a live stream. So I know.
This could cause heart disease. You don't use spike proteins in this way. Excuse me, I actually invented this process and this isn't how I intended it to be. Shut up! You are all hysterical vaccine deniers. You are killing people's grandmothers. Many of you will have seen the British Prime Minister and former Moderna investor Rishi Sunak pilloried on a TV news programme by someone who themselves said that they're suffering from vaccine injury. It seems that the evidence is mounting at such a rate that it's become unignorable. I spoke recently with Pierre Corey, and you can see that interview in full on our channel, who was one of the people who very early on in this pandemic period raised the alarm about the nature of these treatments. This information has been available for some time. I'm fascinated to see how this is going to play out now that it's permeating these spaces.
Foster still digesting the new data released by the Global COVID Vaccine Safety Project, which studied nearly 100 million vaccinated individuals across 8 countries. The report specifically looked at the adverse effects of the Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca vaccines, finding the following. The study links vaccines to slight increases in neurological, blood, and heart-related conditions like myocarditis, pericarditis, and Guillain-Barré syndrome.
What I suspect is happening here is that there has become increasing cynicism about vaccines more broadly.
We were warning about this. You know, not about these specific side effects, but we were saying that there are side effects. Ja, wij zeiden als eerste, als een van de eerste, dat er ook neveneffecten zijn aan een prikje. En ja, we werden weer genegeerd, geblokkeerd en zoiets allemaal. Maar we gaan door. We gaan gewoon door. Ondanks dat we weggefilterd worden of iets in die trend. Ik verdien er niks aan. Dus... Maar we verdienen er helemaal niks aan als we er helemaal niks aan doen. Ja. Dus mensen waarschuwen. Ja, waarschuwen. Kijk mensen, dit gebeurt. Kijk, hier, RHTVLive heeft het hierover gehad. Ja. We hebben maar weer de oorlog in Sudan belicht. En ook die YouTuber, dat hebben we ook even belicht. En dit hier, genoeg onderwerpen op tafel om over te praten. Dus ja, moet je wel open zijn van gedachten. De overheid is niet jouw vriend. Nee, dat zijn niet jouw vrienden. Maar goed, we gaan ook even kijken naar Omroep Poont over de Eritreërs die aan het rellen waren.
Asiel is gewoon echt de domste manier om immigranten toe te laten.
Want niet iedereen van wie de verblijfsvergunning wordt ingetrokken kan worden uitgezet.
Ja, Jan, vorige week zaterdag was er natuurlijk een conflict in Den Haag tussen twee soorten Eritreërs, pro-regime, anti-regime. Even in het kort, wat is daar gebeurd?
Ja, mensen waren daar een feest aan het vieren en die waren pro-regime en tegenstanders. Zijn daar best wel georganiseerd en met staven en zo op afgekomen om dat te verstoren.
Jij bent veel bezig met data. Welke data is er bekend over deze...
So these are the Eritreans that we have in the country that were rioting because one of the people from Eritrea is for the government and the other one is against the government. And this is why these people were rioting. Cop cars were on fire and buses were on fire, stuff like that. It's a war zone, a war zone. But if you, as a Dutch person, go to The Hague, right, to say your voice, then you get a stick in your neck. Yeah, then you got to listen to the cop, right?
Ja, migrantengroep.
Nou, asielzoekers in Afrika is de groep die het gewoon in ons onderzoek Grenzeloze Verzorging staat het slechtst doet.
Je bedoelt Eritreërs?
Nee, niet zozeer Eritreërs, mensen uit de Hoorn van Afrika. Er zit ook Somalië bij, Ethiopië, Soudaan. Dus het is een groep die heel slecht integreert. En als je kijkt naar de jonge asielzoekers uit Eritrea en je vergelijkt dat dan met de gemiddelde asielzoekers of met mensen uit Syrië, dan zie je van de middelbare...
Look at this, man. It's one big war zone. And this is because people from Eritrea disagree. You know, not in my damn country. Damn it. If you want to go fight, right? Go back to your own country. Go back to your own country and get rid of that dictator, right? We know Eritrea is the North Korea of Africa, right? And we know there are no jobs over there, only war, right? We know that the Eritrean soldier is spread out throughout Africa. We know what's going on. And then put these people in the Netherlands? Really?
Schoolleeftijd is dat ook de groep die het gewoon slecht doet op gebied van scholing. Het schept geen gunstig beeld, snap je? Zo'n groep komt ook heel ongunstig natuurlijk erop te staan met dit soort rellen.
Nee, kijk. Mensen in Eritrea, die kunnen geen werk krijgen. Er is geen werk te vinden daar. Het enige wat ze kennen is oorlog. Ja? Men wordt vanaf jeugd af aan getraind om een soldaat te zijn, om uitgeleverd te worden naar andere landen. En dat komt naar Nederland toe. Serieus? Serieus? Wat een land zijn we geworden, man. Wat een land. Maar ja, wij weten beter. Dit is een informatieoorlog waar wij in zitten. Wij weten beter dan wat de overheid ons vertelt. En ja, we geven alleen de informatie zoals het is. De frame van realiteit. Niet de frame van consensus. Ik kan het ook heel erg zielig voor deze mensen vinden in Eritrea. Maar je kent het gezegde bij RHTVLive. Vecht voor het land waar je geboren bent. Of sterf in een land dat je niet meer kent. Ja. En dan moeten die mensen daar ook gaan doen. Ja, om het een beter land van te maken. So fight for the country you live in. Or die in a country you do not know. And these people from Eritrea, they have to also fight for their country. Right? Get rid of tin pot dictator. Anyway. Even kijken. Nog even. En we zijn een minderheid. Ja, dat zijn we al. Dat zijn we al. We zijn al een minderheid in ons eigen land. Ja, er zijn veel meer vluchtelingen dan Nederlanders. Neem dat voor mij aan. Hier, ik zal nog eventjes een filmpje laten zien die we heel vaak afdraaien. En het gaat dus over vluchtelingen. Ja, en dat is allemaal uitgelegd in kauwgomballen. Ja, en we gaan even kijken naar een clipje. Een paar minuten. Over de vluchtelingen.
5,600 gumballs.
Even terug, zo.
Some people say that mass immigration into the United States can help reduce world poverty. Is that true? Well, no, it's not. And let me show you why. This gumball represents the 1 million legal immigrants that the United States has taken every year on average since 1990. Now, who in the world deserves our humanitarian compassion? The World Bank has one measure of the desperately poor of the world. They make less than $2 a day. And how many people make less than $2 a day in the world? We'll start with Africa. In Africa alone, there are 650 million people who make less than $2 a day. 650 million. And in India, another 890 million people, desperately poor. China adds another 480 million people, making less than $2 a day. And unfortunately, the rest of Asia has a heartbreaking 810 million people who the World Bank says make less than $2 a day. And finally, there's 105 million of Latin America's population that are desperately poor. All told, the World Bank says there are 3 billion people in the world. 3 billion people who are desperately poor, making less than $2 a day. That's 3,000 gumballs. And every year, we take 1 million and suggest that we've somehow made a humanitarian difference. Of course, we don't pull our immigrants from these desperately poor populations, do we? These people are too poor, too sick, too disconnected to make it here as immigrants. We tend to pull our immigrants out of the better off poor of the world. And Mexico tends to define the type of immigrant that we bring here because the plurality of people come from Mexico. And Mexico is poor. How many people in the world live in countries that have average incomes lower than that of Mexico? And the World Bank tells us that that number is these 3 billion plus another 2.6 billion people. 5.6 billion people in the world who live in countries with average incomes below that of Mexico. That's 5,600 gumballs. And so what is it that the elites are telling us? They're telling us that when we take this 1 million immigrants, that we somehow or another are tackling world poverty. And we have to do it regardless of the effect on our unemployed, the working poor, the most vulnerable members of our society, regardless of the effect on our natural resources. Even if
we are not changing the world by, having 1 million people in our country, 1 million more. Wij veranderen de wereld niet door allerlei vluchtelingen aan te nemen, waar ze ook vandaan mogen komen. Want ja, er zijn meer arme mensen dan rijke mensen. Ja, kauwgomballen laat het wel zien, hè. Ik hoop dat men dit doorheeft. Het is niet dat ik tegen Afrikanen ben, of mensen uit India, of wat dan ook. Nee, die landen die moeten rijker worden. Zodat die mensen daar ook blijven in dat land. Ja, maar wat wij doen, is wij trekken dus de rijke, arme mensen. In ons opzicht zijn het arme mensen. Maar daar zijn rijke mensen. Dokters, hersenchirurg, whatever else dan ook. Komt allemaal naar Europa toe. Een brain drain. En als dat dus gebeurt, dan blijven die landen gewoon arm. Dan kunnen ze niet vooruit. Juist omdat ze die mensen niet hebben, die een vooruitzichtblik hebben op hoe je de economie en dit en dat moet rijden en zeilen. Die mensen zijn allemaal in Europa of elders, Amerika of zo, of iets in die trend. Een brain drain. En dat gebeurt dus ook in Afrika en elders. Dus, we zijn waakzaam. We weten precies wat er gaande is in de wereld. En we blijven gewoon doorgaan. We vragen geen geld voor. Het enige wat we dus vragen is dit te delen. Deel dit met zoveel politici als je maar wil. Boeit niet. Mensen moeten dit weten. Ja, dus goed. We gaan ook afsluiten. We hebben alweer genoeg gezegd. En we gaan even naar Alex Jones kijken.
The paradigm of absolute control. And that's why we're just out here doing simple things, pointing out that we're meant to be in nature and be natural. And this is where we find a source that God made to transcend the New World Order. And that's why they want to try to keep us out of it.
I'm angry. I've had enough of these people. They're a bunch of Christian murderers scum. They're on giant death factories keeping babies alive and selling their body parts. What more do you need to know about these people? I go out and face these scum. They literally crawl out from under rocks. They have green looking skin and they run around screaming, we love Satan, we wanna eat babies. I have them on video. Hillary's in the creepy weird sick stuff, man. She sleeps in the same room with that creepy weird woman whose mother wears a hood over her head. What the hell? That woman number one is ugly. Imagine how bad she smells, man. I'm told her and Obama just stink. Obama and Hillary both smell like sulfur. In a roof vampire pot, there the goblins are hobbling round, coming after us. My spirit gets close to that evil and I feel it go. We're such self-centered crap. We don't even notice hell itself rising up against us. Millions of pointed people of the very worst type, and I'm so pissed. We're gonna stab your daughter at the mall. We're gonna stab your wife, your son. We're gonna stab you with a butcher knife, and then the police chief is gonna say, we love our Somalis, we love our Muslims. Oh, they're so good. Oh, they're so sweet.
No, they're not.
I was watching Fox News as I worked out.
They're not sweet, okay? They're not sweet. And not all people are bad, but most people, in Africa, they only know war. They don't have any compassion for anyone else except for themselves. Right? They only know war. Ja, mensen, dat gebeurt. De Afrikanen zijn niet zo heel erg dankbaar en zoiets. Lang niet allemaal. Er zijn ook mensen die wel dankbaar zijn. Maar in het algemeen kennen ze alleen maar oorlog. En dat hoort hier niet thuis. Nee, wij moeten ervoor zorgen dat daar vrede is. Dan hoeven ze niet hier naartoe te komen. Goed. Vergeet niet mensen, ook binnenkort dan komen we dus bij de poppenkast. Ja. En als alles goed gaat, we laten ook even wat reclame zien voor de poppenkast. En hopelijk kan ik met deze Peter, of hoe heet die, Peter is het geloof ik, kan ik daarmee in discussie gaan over van alles en nog wat geopolitiek. Erg interessant. Dus, doei mensen. En we zien ons later weer.